In 1987, a pharmaceutical company bought a patent for a drug that cost about $4 a month to manufacture. Clinical trials suggested it worked just as well as, and in some cases slightly better than, a competing medication that was already being prepared for market at around $200 per month. The company bought the patent, and then the drug disappeared. It was never developed, never manufactured, never sold. 2 years later, the expensive branded medication launched. Within a few years, it became one of the best-selling prescription drugs in the United States. The cheaper alternative never reached the market. This is not a rumor. It is not speculation. The acquisition was recorded in regulatory filings, referenced in later litigation, and discussed during Federal Trade Commission investigations into pharmaceutical competition practices. And according to several independent pharmacologists and health economists who later studied the industry, this case was not unique. It reflected a broader pattern, one with a clear business logic and a very predictable outcome. To understand how something like this could happen, we have to go back a few years, back to 1984. That year, the United States passed a law called the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act, better known as the Hatch-Waxman Act. The goal of the law was simple. It was designed to make it easier for generic drug manufacturers to bring lower-cost versions of existing medications to market. Before this law, generic manufacturers often had to repeat expensive clinical trials, even if the active ingredient was identical to a branded drug. Hatch-Waxman changed that. Generic companies only needed to prove something called bioequivalence, that their version delivered the same active ingredient at the same rate as the original medication. At the time, the law was widely celebrated. Economists predicted it would save American consumers billions of dollars. But the law also triggered a strategic response from the pharmaceutical industry. Large companies quickly realized that easier generic competition could threaten some of their most profitable products, so they adapted. One strategy became known as evergreening. Instead of relying on a single patent, companies filed additional patents covering small modifications of an existing drug, changes in dosage, coatings, delivery mechanisms, or release timing. Each new patent could extend exclusivity and delay competition. Another strategy involved something called authorized generics. In this arrangement, a brand name manufacturer released its own generic version through a subsidiary company. This allowed the company to capture part of the lower price market while making it harder for independent generic competitors to gain traction. But there was a third strategy, and it was remarkably simple: acquisition. When a large pharmaceutical company was developing a major drug, it carefully monitored other research that might produce competing treatments. Small companies and university labs often worked on similar ideas but lacked the funding required for large clinical trials and regulatory approval. If one of those research programs showed promising results, a larger company could simply buy it. Once the patent was acquired, the compound was legally controlled by the new owner, and sometimes development simply stopped. The research program closed, the trials never advanced. The compound remained inside a patent portfolio, but it never reached the market. Meanwhile, the branded medication continued its path toward approval. Over time, regulators began to notice patterns like this. In the mid-1990s, the Federal Trade Commission started investigating certain pharmaceutical practices that appeared to delay generic competition. One category of cases became known as pay-for-delay agreements, situations where brand name manufacturers paid generic companies to postpone market entry. In a report published in 2010, the FTC estimated that these agreements were costing American consumers about $3.5 billion every year in higher drug prices, and that estimate only captured cases with clear legal documentation. Situations involving compounds that were acquired and quietly abandoned were far harder to measure, but they were not impossible to find. The case from 1987 involved a class of compounds being studied for a chronic condition affecting millions of Americans. During the early 1980s, several small pharmaceutical companies and university laboratories were researching molecules that showed promising early results. In at least 2 documented cases, early trial data suggested that these compounds could perform as well as, and sometimes better than, a branded drug being developed by a major manufacturer. Instead of racing to compete, the larger companies acquired the research. Between 1985 and 1989, multiple patent applications covering similar treatment mechanisms were purchased from smaller firms. The acquisition prices ranged from under $1 million to just over $4 million. For companies with research budgets in the hundreds of millions, these were relatively small expenses. After the acquisitions, development of the compounds stopped. The patents remained active, but clinical trials never advanced, and no manufacturing processes were developed. Meanwhile, the branded medication entered the market with no comparable low-cost competitor. Years later, details of these events surfaced during patent litigation. One of the original developers attempted to reclaim rights to a shelved compound under abandonment provisions. Court filings from that dispute provided one of the clearest records of how this strategy operated in practice. The cost difference at the center of the story was also real. Many of the compounds being researched during this period were based on molecules that had already been described in earlier pharmaceutical literature. By the early 1980s, the chemistry required to produce them was straightforward. Manufacturing estimates placed the cost of producing a single dose between roughly 8 cents and 40 cents, depending on the formulation. At a typical 30-day supply, that translated to about $4 per month. The barrier preventing these compounds from reaching the market was not technical difficulty. It was the legal and patent landscape surrounding the treatment category. In theory, a physician who understood that landscape could identify equivalent compounds through compounding pharmacies or international generic manufacturers. But most physicians rely on prescribing information, clinical guidelines, and educational materials that are heavily influenced by the companies producing approved branded medications. The information existed, but it was rarely located where doctors and patients were most likely to look. In 2003, another major change occurred. Congress passed the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act. One provision in that law prevented the federal government from negotiating drug prices directly on behalf of Medicare beneficiaries. Many health economists opposed the restriction at the time, but it remained in place for nearly 2 decades. During those years, pharmaceutical pricing continued to rise. In 2021, an independent health economics organization called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review examined dozens of widely prescribed branded medications. The analysis found that many had prices that were difficult to justify based on clinical evidence, especially when compared with lower-cost alternatives. The report did not claim that physicians were acting improperly. Instead, it concluded that prescribing decisions often occur within an information environment shaped by pharmaceutical marketing, advertising, and funding structures connected to medical education and clinical guidelines. Within that environment, expensive options can easily become the default standard of care. For patients and physicians, several tools exist that make the pricing landscape easier to navigate. One of the most useful is the FDA's Orange Book, a publicly accessible database listing approved drug products and their generic equivalents. Anyone can search it online to see whether a branded medication has an approved generic alternative. Another tool is pharmacy price comparison platforms such as GoodRx, which show how the cost of the same medication can vary widely between pharmacies. A drug listed at $200 through standard retail pricing may sometimes be available as a generic for a fraction of that cost. Another option involves compounding pharmacies, which can prepare medications from raw pharmaceutical ingredients when the compounds involved are off-patent and medically appropriate. And finally, there is the clinical research literature itself, including systematic reviews produced by organizations such as the Cochrane Collaboration, which analyze treatments based on evidence quality rather than marketing budgets. These resources exist, but many patients never learn about them. In 2022, the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which included a provision allowing Medicare to negotiate prices for certain high-cost medications for the first time in decades. When the first group of drugs selected for negotiation was announced in 2023, many of them had long histories of high prices and complex patent strategies. The pharmaceutical industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying against that provision. Public lobbying records show just how valuable those pricing structures had become. The shelved patent from 1987 is only one example in a much larger story. Across the pharmaceutical landscape, there are many cases where older or less expensive treatments exist, but receive far less attention than newer branded alternatives. The reasons are complex and involve science, regulation, economics, and information systems. But one conclusion appears repeatedly in economic studies of healthcare. Access to information can dramatically change healthcare costs. For patients, asking about generic options, comparing pharmacy prices, and reviewing independent research can sometimes reveal alternatives that are significantly more affordable. These are not radical actions, they are simply informed choices. Choices that become easier once you understand how the system works.